Could the shocking truth behind Kate Middleton and Pope Francis's alleged secret affair finally come to light after his death? What really happened behind closed doors? In an unexpected turn of events, Kate Middleton has broken her silence on the late Pope Francis, revealing explosive details of their controversial relationship. For years, whispers have circulated about their alleged secret affair, but now, after his death, Kate is finally setting the record straight. Was this the shocking truth that could tear apart the royal image? And what does this mean for the future of the British monarchy and the Vatican? Stay tuned as we dive deep into the scandal that could shake both the church and the crown. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. It was just past midnight when the news flashed across screens around the world. Pope Francis, the spiritual leader of over 1 billion Catholics, had passed away peacefully in his Vatican residence. Tributes poured in from world leaders, spiritual figures, and millions of devoted followers. Flags were lowered, candles were lit, and prayers echoed from cathedrals to chapels across continents. But amidst the wave of global mourning, a completely different current began to ripple just beneath the surface. It started as a whisper, barely noticed, barely believed, until that whisper became an uncontrollable storm. Because within 48 hours of the Pope's death, an anonymous leak shook Buckingham Palace to its core and threatened to derail everything we thought we knew about one of the world's most admired royals. The leak wasn't about politics, nor doctrine, nor the Vatican's oft-criticized secrecy. No, it was far more personal, far more sensational. It was about Kate Middleton, the Princess of Wales. Beloved across the UK, often hailed as the modern face of the monarchy, and until now, universally respected as both a public figure and a private woman. The documents leaked suggested something so implausible, so beyond the limits of public imagination, that it was dismissed at first as fabrication, an internet hoax, even propaganda. But the more people tried to look away, the more the story refused to die. According to the documents, emails, handwritten notes, voice recordings never meant to surface, Kate had been involved in a long-standing, deeply personal, and ultimately romantic affair with none other than Pope Francis himself. Yes, that Pope Francis. The same Pope who washed prisoners' feet, preached humility from St. Peter's Basilica, and vowed celibacy in honor of his sacred calling. An affair that allegedly lasted years, involved multiple private meetings in Rome, secret handwritten letters, and even moments of physical intimacy during Kate's visits to Vatican City as part of her royal duties. To say the world was stunned would be an understatement. The Vatican remained silent. Buckingham Palace issued a stern no comment. But Kate herself, once the paragon of regal restraint, broke the unspoken code of silence. She spoke, not through a press conference, not through a carefully edited Instagram story, but through a private video filmed from an undisclosed location, likely meant to be seen only by her family and closest advisors. In the video, her voice was calm. Her eyes, swollen from tears, and her words? Devastating. "I never meant for any of this to happen," she said. "He made me feel safe. He listened. He reminded me that even someone trapped in tradition can find meaning in connection." There was no apology, no denial. Only a heavy silence between each phrase, as if every sentence carried the weight of a kingdom's shame. And though the video was never meant to be made public, it leaked. Everything leaked. Within hours, clips were clipped, screenshots circulated, and hashtags exploded across platforms. To understand how such a scandal could even be possible, we must go back, years back, when the seeds of this tangled story were first sown, when diplomacy blurred with emotion, and when the eyes of the public were too focused on fashion statements and baby bumps to notice the quiet, slow-burning crisis happening behind palace gates and Vatican walls. In 2017, Kate embarked on what the Royal Communications Office described as a cultural and religious goodwill tour on behalf of the Queen. One of her stops was Vatican City. Her audience with Pope Francis was praised in the press, praised by photographers who captured her modest veil and respectful curtsy. It was described as cordial, warm, and appropriate. But what those polished press releases failed to mention were the extra hours unaccounted for. The extended stay. The second visit, unlisted on the official schedule. The papal aide who resigned mysteriously 3 weeks later. And perhaps most tellingly, the subtle change in Kate's public demeanor when she returned to the UK, less composed, more distracted, some even whispered, more human. By 2018, insiders claimed Kate was making more frequent trips to Italy than anyone could explain. Officially, they were for charity or fashion-related events. But the locations always aligned with moments when Pope Francis had made private appearances outside the Vatican, at retreats, monasteries, and secluded religious centers with no press access. When questioned, Kate always smiled, gracefully diverted the topic, or said it was just duty. The royal family's code of silence held firm. But then came the handwritten letters, allegedly penned by Pope Francis himself, recovered in a Vatican clean-out after his death, addressed not to Princess of Wales, but to Catherine. Not one letter, dozens. Some filled with spiritual musings, some with metaphors about love and divinity. Others far less abstract. "I fear what I feel for you," read one excerpt. "But in your presence, I feel closer to God than I do in any chapel." Those letters, reportedly authenticated by linguistic experts, were leaked not by a journalist or a hacker, but by someone within the Vatican itself. A former archivist who claimed that hiding them felt like betraying both heaven and truth. And if the letters were the match, the video was the fire. Kate's video confession, filmed months earlier during a mental health retreat, was meant as a private testimony, either for the church or for William. In it, she described Pope Francis not as a spiritual leader, but as a man, lonely, passionate, and full of contradictions. She did not detail physical acts, but hinted unmistakably at them. "We broke the rules," she admitted, "and I've lived with the guilt every day." At the center of this storm lies a series of questions no one seems able or willing to answer. Why did Kate keep this hidden for so long? Was this a genuine emotional bond, or something else entirely, an abuse of influence, spiritual manipulation, or political strategy? Did Queen Elizabeth know? And perhaps most crucially, what will Prince William do now? Observers say he's been seen more withdrawn than usual. Sources say he's betrayed but torn. For the monarchy, this is more than a scandal. It's an existential threat. For the church, it's an unthinkable fall from grace. For the public, it's a mystery that seems to grow more twisted by the day. In this video, we will investigate every piece of this astonishing story. From the first contact between Kate and the Pope, to the leaked letters, to the alleged cover-up inside both the Vatican and Buckingham Palace. We will speak with experts, historians, and insiders who've dared to step forward. We'll analyze the coded messages, the coincidences, and the moments we all missed. And by the end, we'll ask one final question. In a world of royalty and religion, where everything is orchestrated, what happens when something real slips through the cracks? Stay with us as we peel back the layers. This story isn't just about a woman and a pope. It's about power, secrecy, temptation, and the devastating price of silence. For centuries, the British monarchy and the Vatican have stood as two of the most powerful and symbolically loaded institutions in the world, one rooted in royal bloodlines, the other in spiritual authority. They have moved in separate orbits, but their paths have crossed more often than the public realizes. Most of those intersections were cordial, ceremonial, and scripted down to the second. Yet beneath the pageantry and protocol, history tells of tensions, alliances, and back-channel negotiations that have shaped both institutions in profound ways. When it comes to Kate Middleton's connection to the Vatican, the official narrative has always been one of polite diplomacy. She was never expected to stir controversy. In fact, she was considered by both British royalists and international media as the safe member of the royal family, the elegant, educated wife of the future king who managed to smile on cue and rarely spoke out of turn. But few paid attention to how frequently Kate was tasked with attending interfaith events, particularly those involving high-ranking figures in the Catholic Church. It seemed routine, unremarkable, until you start lining up the dates, locations, and faces. Long before Pope Francis ever became a headline-grabbing reformer or the subject of global affection, he was Cardinal Jorge Mario Bergoglio of Argentina, known for his humble demeanor, his fierce intellect, and his insistence on connecting with the people beyond the layers of ecclesiastical ceremony. When he was elected Pope in 2013, the British royal family released a statement of congratulations, as they always do in such circumstances. But behind palace doors, senior aides were reportedly intrigued, and in some cases, nervous. Despite the secular nature of Britain's political state, the monarchy remains entangled with religious symbolism. The sovereign is the supreme governor of the Church of England, a Protestant institution historically formed in direct opposition to the authority of the Pope. That rift, dating back to Henry VIII, is still considered politically sensitive. So, when Pope Francis emerged as a charismatic and wildly popular spiritual leader in the modern era, the palace understood one thing: diplomatic relations would become more important than ever, but they must be handled with extreme caution. Kate Middleton, ever the picture of poise, was seen as the ideal figure to manage that relationship. She could represent the crown without the baggage of political involvement, and she carried none of the controversy associated with Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, who by that time had begun their own tumultuous journey away from royal life. Kate was calm, predictable, or so it seemed. The Vatican, for its part, welcomed her presence. But even among seasoned Vatican officials, some were reportedly unsettled by how warmly Pope Francis responded to her visits. One witness, who requested anonymity for fear of professional retribution, said the Pope's behavior during Kate's 2017 visit was uncharacteristically warm, almost intimate in his language and body posture. Photographs from that day do show an extended handshake, eye contact that lingers longer than expected, and a moment of quiet conversation away from the cameras. That moment, many believe, was the start of something hidden and unthinkable. It's important to note that papal visits from foreign dignitaries are governed by strict protocol. Timing, seating, and language are all choreographed meticulously by Vatican staff. And yet, reports began surfacing that Kate's visit had deviated from standard procedure. She was granted a second private audience, highly unusual for someone of her rank. An unnamed security officer later leaked that she was escorted through non-public passageways of the Apostolic Palace, typically reserved for cardinals or heads of state. No British royal had ever received such treatment in recent memory. What followed was a string of quiet but telling decisions. Kate's office at Kensington Palace, for instance, began receiving direct diplomatic briefings from the Vatican's Secretariat of State, usually handled only by the UK Foreign Office. She was invited to a religious art exhibition in Milan with Vatican sponsorship. A Vatican archivist, later dismissed without explanation, noted in a private blog that Kate Middleton was seen more times in Rome in 2018 than most Catholic heads of state. These weren't official visits. No press. No announcements. No photos. Why would a Protestant royal, bound by British tradition, engage so frequently with the highest echelons of Catholic power? Some have argued that the answer lies in mutual interest. The Vatican, seeking relevance in an increasingly secular Europe, may have viewed Kate as a potential ally, a modern, media-savvy royal who could soften the public perception of religious authority. And Kate, known to struggle with the constraints of royal life, may have found in Pope Francis a kindred spirit. A man also burdened by expectations, ceremony, and an institution constantly in crisis. But those who knew the Pope well argue that any relationship with Kate, even if emotionally significant, would have been deeply complicated. Pope Francis had made vows. Celibacy, devotion. He was the most powerful religious figure on earth, and to even suggest an emotional or romantic entanglement would have been heresy for millions. That's what made the early signs so easy to ignore. Nobody wanted to believe it, even those closest to Kate. By 2019, something shifted. Kate's public appearances took on a slightly different tone. Observers noted a growing introspection in her posture and expression. She was present, but not engaged. Polite, but emotionally distant. Her once glowing smile was now described by royal photographers as haunted or somber. At the same time, whispers began to circulate that her relationship with William had grown strained. They rarely attended events together unless protocol required it. Their body language became a frequent subject of tabloid speculation. Then came the sudden resignation of a mid-level Vatican official, Father Alessandro Vincenzi, whose job was to coordinate foreign dignitary visits. According to leaked Vatican memos, Father Vincenzi was involved in organizing 2 private sessions between Pope Francis and a British royal not listed on the diplomatic calendar. Those sessions, both in early 2019, were conducted without press access and reportedly lasted several hours each. Vincenzi refused to speak to journalists. But one of his former colleagues, now based in France, told a European newspaper that something happened during those visits that shook the internal order of the Vatican. What that something was remains undefined. But around the same time, British tabloids began to receive anonymous tips, emails, and calls from international numbers, claiming to have evidence of unholy intimacy between a senior royal and a senior religious figure. Most editors dismissed it. Too risky, too unbelievable, too damaging. But some began quietly investigating. Meanwhile, tensions rose inside Buckingham Palace. There was a brief internal review of Kate's communications, supposedly tied to cybersecurity concerns. But some believe the real reason was to recover and suppress potentially damaging messages between her and the Vatican that had bypassed official diplomatic channels. The Royal Communications Office declined to comment. So did Scotland Yard. All the while, the public saw only the polished exterior of royal life, charity events, ribbon cuttings, official portraits. Kate was seen kneeling at remembrance ceremonies and smiling at school children. But behind palace walls, she was reportedly begging to step away from royal duties, citing mental health and spiritual fatigue. William, according to insiders, believed she was suffering from burnout. But those closest to her knew something deeper was at play. One longtime palace staffer, who retired in 2020, claimed Kate would frequently retreat into the private chapel within Kensington Palace, often for hours, sometimes in tears. When asked what she prayed for, she once reportedly answered, clarity and forgiveness. It wasn't until after Pope Francis' death that the full weight of their connection would come to light. But in hindsight, the signs were always there. Not just in her travel logs or the letters, but in the subtle, almost imperceptible unraveling of her public persona. The way she shifted from confident to cautious. The way her speeches became more abstract, more introspective. The way her smiles no longer reached her eyes. This was not just a story about diplomacy gone wrong. It was about two people, each trapped in their own institutions, who found something dangerously human in one another. Whether it was love, manipulation, or mutual desperation remains unknown. But the Vatican and the palace, once symbols of moral clarity and tradition, now find themselves forever linked by a scandal neither can afford to fully acknowledge. And in that quiet space between denial and truth, Kate Middleton made a choice. She broke the silence, not for public sympathy, not for damage control, but perhaps, simply, because she could no longer carry it alone. Long before the headlines, the whispers, and the scandalous revelations that would set two global institutions into defensive silence, there was a single meeting. Not a press conference, not a state banquet. Just two people, one dressed in papal white, the other veiled in black as tradition requires, seated across from one another in a private chamber in the Vatican, behind gilded doors no camera could capture. That meeting, which took place on April 27, 2017, now lives in infamy, not because of what was seen, but because of what was never supposed to be known. The official story was straightforward. As part of a royal diplomatic tour through Italy and the Vatican, Catherine, Duchess of Cambridge, made a brief visit to Vatican City on behalf of the Queen. The trip was coordinated alongside representatives from the UK Foreign Office and the Holy See's diplomatic staff. Papal audiences with visiting royalty are not uncommon. They serve a symbolic purpose, to reinforce interfaith respect and promote shared humanitarian goals. The royal household had released a schedule that mentioned a 25-minute meeting followed by a viewing of certain religious artifacts. But according to internal Vatican memos and testimonies gathered after Pope Francis' death, what happened that day went far beyond protocol. The meeting began at precisely 10 a.m. local time, within the Pope's apostolic palace. Kate, accompanied by two senior aides, was escorted by Swiss guards into the Hall of Benedictions. She wore a long black dress with lace sleeves and a black lace veil covering her hair, adhering to traditional Vatican dress code for female royals. Her demeanor, as caught on footage broadcast on the Vatican's own media network, was calm, serene, and deferential. She bowed slightly, shook the Pope's hand, and exchanged pleasantries through her translator. What's curious is what happened next. Cameras were immediately ushered out after the first 2 minutes, unusual for visits of this kind, where photographers are typically allowed to capture at least 5 minutes of footage. Eyewitnesses say the door to the meeting room remained closed for more than an hour, longer than any other royal audience in recent memory. Her aides reportedly remained outside the chamber for the entire duration. Those aides, now bound by confidentiality agreements, have never publicly discussed what happened in that room. But a former Vatican cleric, who claims to have reviewed scheduling and room logs during his tenure, noted an unusual annotation on the internal document that day, private follow-up dialogue requested. No staff present. Personal discretion advised. The note was flagged due to its rarity. Papal audiences almost always involve a third party, if only for the purposes of translation or clerical documentation. According to multiple insiders, this was not a one-time error in scheduling. It was an intentional decision, allegedly made by Pope Francis himself, to meet Kate alone. She spoke fluent Italian. He spoke English well enough. There would be no need for interpreters. What was said in that room will never be known verbatim, but what came out of it sparked a series of quiet disturbances within both the Vatican and the royal household. Kate's scheduled tour of Vatican museums was abruptly canceled, citing logistical challenges. Her car departed the Vatican compound through a side gate not commonly used by foreign guests, and according to her travel logs, she returned to her residence in Rome unusually early that day and reportedly remained in seclusion for the next 36 hours. One senior diplomat based in Rome at the time recalled overhearing hushed conversations among Vatican staff about the deep intensity of the encounter. Another British official stationed in Italy remembered being told to refrain from asking questions about the visit, noting that the tone from London was unusually tense. In the weeks following the meeting, Pope Francis is said to have rewritten portions of a sermon he had been preparing, choosing to focus instead on themes of temptation, human frailty, and the loneliness of leadership. Several Vatican observers found this shift in theme curious, especially given the celebratory nature of the original occasion. One particular line from his address drew attention. Sometimes, in our quietest moments, we hear voices not from heaven, but from the reflection of our own longing. To many, it seemed like a poetic turn. To a few, it sounded like a confession. Kate, meanwhile, returned to London and resumed her public duties. But subtle changes began to emerge. She requested more time off from royal engagements than usual. Sources inside Kensington Palace whispered that she had become distracted, spiritually restless, and increasingly disinterested in the routine of palace life. One staff member said she would retreat into the royal library and spend hours reading philosophical and theological texts, unusual for someone previously focused on early childhood development and mental health campaigns. In private, Kate reportedly began writing letters. Not emails. Not texts. Letters. Long, handwritten pages delivered through personal couriers rather than the royal mail or official diplomatic channels. Some of those letters, it would later be alleged, were addressed directly to Pope Francis. That alone would have raised eyebrows. But what turned whispers into a storm was the nature of their contents. According to leaked fragments provided by a now-defected Vatican archivist, the letters did not simply contain platitudes or formal correspondence. They contained reflections on loneliness, purpose, guilt, and connection. In one passage, Kate reportedly wrote, "You see a world that listens to you but does not understand you. I live in a world that understands me, but never really listens." Another excerpt, alleged but not yet authenticated, read, "I see more kindness in your silence than in all the noise of my kingdom." If true, these are not the words of a casual acquaintance. They are the words of someone seeking solace in another, not just emotionally but spiritually. The Vatican has never confirmed the existence of these letters, nor has the royal family commented, but their silence has only amplified suspicion, especially because, according to sources familiar with Vatican internal audits, a private courier system was established in late 2017 between the papal apartments and the British diplomatic mission in Rome. A system used only twice, once in 2013 and then repeatedly after April 2017. This was not standard procedure, and it was not temporary. By the end of 2017, Pope Francis reportedly scheduled 2 more private meetings with unnamed dignitaries. Though never publicly listed, travel and security records suggest that Kate may have quietly returned to Rome twice in the last half of that year, under the pretense of charity or cultural engagements. Her security team logged international flights that were marked as royal discretion, a designation rarely used outside of wartime or health emergencies. Every step of this evolving relationship was covered in layers of protocol, secrecy, and coded language. But even the most carefully constructed secrets cannot survive forever. The first breach came from within. A member of the Pontifical Swiss Guard, assigned to external security during one of Kate's alleged private visits, began speaking off the record to journalists after his dismissal for unrelated disciplinary issues. He claimed he witnessed her being escorted not to the official audience hall, but to the Pope's private living quarters. He described the mood as reverent but strangely personal, saying there was a softness between them, something unspoken but clear. "I've guarded this place for a decade. I know when something is different. Still, most media outlets ignored the rumors. The Vatican remained untouchable, and Kate was still the jewel of the royal image machine. Then Pope Francis became ill. In late 2023, as his health visibly declined, several Vatican insiders began collecting and archiving documents from his papacy. That process, usually kept private, became a source of leakage when one young cleric decided he could no longer hold back. His name has not been released, but he is known to have fled Italy shortly after transmitting files to an encrypted online archive. The files included scanned letters, video transcriptions, and a logbook from the Pope's personal secretary. All evidence pointed toward an emotional and possibly physical relationship between the Pope and a foreign royal representative, later confirmed to be Kate Middleton. Though much of the world was still in mourning over Pope Francis' death when these files first surfaced, the attention quickly shifted. Was this relationship consensual? Was it emotionally manipulative? Was it real at all, or a construct born of intense spiritual pressure and institutional loneliness? Whatever the case, it all began with a single meeting. 1 hour, behind closed doors. A conversation between two people who, by every rule of their worlds, should have remained strangers. But they didn't. And the consequences of that meeting, subtle at first, then overwhelming, would unravel institutions that claimed to be unshakable. From that moment on, Kate was no longer just a royal figure. She was a woman entangled in the secrets of two empires. A symbol not only of duty, but a forbidden connection. And as the full story continues to unfold, that first meeting remains the thread from which the entire tapestry now hangs. The idea of letters exchanged between a Catholic pope and a British royal might sound like standard diplomacy. In any other context, it would be official correspondence, typed, reviewed by aides, sent via couriers, is common protocol for both institutions. But the letters between Kate Middleton and Pope Francis weren't written by secretaries. They weren't sent through official government channels. They weren't logged. They weren't supposed to exist at all. And yet, according to multiple insiders, those handwritten, deeply personal messages are not only real. They are now at the center of a quiet but intense effort to contain a scandal that neither Buckingham Palace nor the Vatican knows how to explain away. The existence of these letters first came to light through a leak. Not a journalist, not a rival royal, but a defector from within the Vatican's historical archives. A man in his mid-30s, a trained theologian and archivist, reportedly fled Vatican City under threat of dismissal after raising concerns about what he described as a gross violation of doctrinal integrity and personal boundaries. He contacted a European media watchdog group from a secure location, sharing digital scans of 5 handwritten letters and claiming there were over 30 more, all stored in a locked file beneath the Vatican Apostolic Archives, formerly known as the Secret Archives. What was contained in those first 5 letters was enough to set off a firestorm. The letters are all written in English, in the unmistakable flowing script of Pope Francis. Each letter is dated, marked with Vatican letterhead, but curiously lacks any of the typical archival stamps used for official documentation. They appear to have been written on personal papal stationery, the kind reserved for private notes rather than state communication. The earliest one is dated May 2, 2017, just 5 days after Kate's first visit to the Vatican. In that letter, Pope Francis writes of the unusual stillness that followed her departure, confessing he felt a weight of absence in her wake. "I have spoken to thousands," he writes, "but rarely have I felt so heard. There is something profoundly familiar about your spirit. You remind me of a time before I wore this robe." The phrasing is abstract, almost poetic. But as the letters progress, the language grows more emotional, more intimate, and ultimately, more explicit in tone. The second letter, dated July 19, 2017, references a follow-up meeting away from the public eye, thanking her for the candor, the warmth, and the difficult truths you allowed me to witness. In the third, dated September 3, the Pope appears to express internal conflict. "I am torn between what I vowed and what I feel, between the image I represent and the soul I long to speak freely with." He does not name Kate directly in any of these letters, yet the references are unmistakable. References to private conversations, to shared readings, to phrases used only between them. More compelling is the handwriting analysis conducted by a team of forensic document experts in Germany, who authenticated the letters based on known papal writings, noting over 90% match in ink pressure, slant, signature formation, and cross-stroke patterns. They stopped short of calling the documents indisputably real. Without physical access to the originals, such claims remained speculative, but they confirmed the consistency matched closely with Pope Francis' known private writing style. The final letter in the leak, dated February 2018, is where speculation turned into panic. In it, the Pope makes a reference to the night in Florence, writing, "It was not physicality that made it sacred. It was the stillness between words, the closeness and silence. You showed me I was still capable of feeling like a man." That sentence, more than any other, has been interpreted as a confession of romantic intimacy. Some read it as metaphor. Others, more critically, as an admission of emotional infidelity, if not more. There is no response letter from Kate among the leaked documents, but insiders have confirmed that responses do exist and that they were stored not in the Vatican, but in a personal file kept within Kensington Palace. A file allegedly marked only with the letter K, containing multiple handwritten notes, each folded neatly and tied with a thin ribbon. Only a handful of staff were aware of this file. Most palace aides believed it to be a collection of journal entries. Only one knew the truth, and it was that aide who reportedly alerted royal security the day after the Pope's death. According to sources close to the investigation, the aide feared that the existence of those letters would become known after the Vatican announced an official review of Pope Francis' personal archives. In a closed-door meeting held at Buckingham Palace 2 days later, senior advisors and legal counsel reportedly reviewed scanned copies of the letters, and a decision was made immediately. The contents must never see daylight. But they already had. By the time the royal household attempted to contain the leak, the story had already been picked up by 3 international outlets, 2 in Italy, 1 in Spain, and translated into over a dozen languages. The Vatican refused to comment. So did the British government. Kate's public schedule was cleared for the following week. When she was spotted in public again, it was at a church in Norfolk, entering alone with a visibly distressed expression. What these letters represent is far greater than a personal failure. They expose the raw vulnerability of 2 of the most powerful institutions on earth, neither of which is prepared to explain how their most revered figures were entangled in something so human, so fallible, and so off-limits. The letters reveal not just affection, but shared doubt. Pope Francis, in one passage, describes the crushing silence of obligation. Kate, in one alleged response, writes of wishing for just one moment of real freedom. No duty, no eyes, no crown, no creed. These were not the words of a diplomat and a clergyman. They were the words of 2 individuals suffocating in roles carved for them by history. The most dangerous aspect of the letters isn't their romantic tone. It's their clarity. These were not impulsive expressions. They were thoughtful, deliberate, and in some cases, preserved as if for future remembrance. Why? Some believe they were meant as a record, a testimony, something private, yes, but something that might one day be seen, if only by their families. Others believe they were a risk taken too far, an emotional attachment that slowly, then rapidly, spiraled into something neither side could control. There is speculation now that the Vatican itself had been aware of the letters for years, that select members of the Curia had tried, in vain, to remove or suppress them. One rumor suggests a secret conclave was held in 2021 to determine whether Pope Francis should be urged to retire, not for health, but for personal compromise. That theory remains unconfirmed. But the timing of the Pope's increasingly reclusive behavior in his final year, combined with his reported refusal to name a successor, has fueled speculation that he was trying to protect someone, perhaps even Kate. As of now, neither the original letters nor Kate's alleged responses have been released in full. Only fragments. But already, scholars and public commentators are dissecting every word. What they represent is a shift in how we understand leadership, devotion, and the deep cost of duty. They show that the crown and the church, 2 symbols of control and tradition, are, at their core, shaped by people struggling to carry what they were born into or called to. Kate has not spoken publicly about the letters. But one thing is now certain, whether by emotional need, spiritual hunger, or some unspoken bond, she and Pope Francis exchanged more than formalities. They shared pieces of themselves that no royal protocol or religious doctrine could contain. It wasn't meant for the world to see. Not the public, not the press, not even the wider royal family. It was filmed privately, allegedly at a remote estate far from the eyes of the palace and the ears of the crown. No production crew. No teleprompter. Just Kate, seated alone before a softly glowing lamp. her face bare of makeup, her hands trembling slightly in her lap. The woman in the frame was not the Duchess of Cambridge. She was not a royal. She was not the polished figure familiar to millions through magazine covers and Christmas broadcasts. She was simply Catherine. A woman on the verge of breaking under the weight of a secret too heavy to carry. The video, originally labeled only with the initial CMP and a date stamp of March 13, 2024, was stored in an encrypted drive inside a small case, hidden behind a false panel in a safe at a royal-owned countryside retreat. Its discovery came not through betrayal or espionage, but by accident. A personal staff member sent to retrieve unrelated legal files stumbled upon it and reported the find. A senior palace advisor made the decision to view the content before it could be destroyed. What he saw, according to multiple anonymous insiders, stunned him to the point of tears. Kate sat in silence for nearly a full minute before she began to speak. She didn't use titles. She didn't defend herself. She didn't smile. Her voice was calm but cracked with emotion, and her first words were simple. I never wanted this to come out, but it has to. Because it's already tearing apart everything around me, and I can't lie anymore, not to myself, not to him, and not to the people I love. From that point forward, the narrative unraveled in waves of raw confession. She spoke about a moment of unexpected connection with Pope Francis, about feeling seen in a way she hadn't since her early 20s, before her marriage, before the weight of the royal schedule made every glance rehearsed and every word pre-approved. She described what she called a moment of emotional vulnerability during their first real conversation. It was quiet, slow, thoughtful, full of pauses and unfinished sentences, she said. She talked about how he listened, not as a pope, but as a man who understood what it meant to live under the crushing pressure of representing an ideal. Kate didn't use sensational language. Her tone was reflective, not dramatic. She admitted to returning to Rome privately on multiple occasions, sometimes in coordination with charitable initiatives, sometimes under pretext. She confessed to writing to him long letters that she never expected to be answered, but they were, and she kept writing. She called it a dialogue between souls lost in duty. One of the most striking parts of the video was when she spoke about the nature of their connection. She made no explicit claim of physical intimacy. There were no dates, no places, no details that could be verified. But she did not deny it either. Instead, she said something chillingly ambiguous. What we shared was sacred. Whether it was ever physical or stayed only in spirit, I don't think even I know where one ended and the other began. What I do know is that I crossed a line. I crossed many, and I've carried the guilt in every silence since. She paused, took a breath, looked away from the camera for a moment as if gathering the strength to continue. Then she said something that, had it been spoken aloud on a public stage, might have sparked a constitutional crisis. There were moments I thought I might leave. Not just the role, not just the family, but everything. I thought I could start over. Just be me. Not Her Royal Highness. Not the perfect mother, or wife, or daughter-in-law. Just someone who chose their own path. But I couldn't. Because of the children. Because of the crown. Because of what people would say. And now, it's too late. What followed was a long silence. No cuts. No edits. Just the stillness of someone unraveling their own history in real time. When she finally spoke again, her voice was even softer. He never asked me to leave. He never even asked me to stay. He only ever asked me to be honest with myself. And I wasn't. I lied to him. I lied to William. I lied to the world. And it didn't protect anyone. It only broke me. Her words offered no excuses. No moral justification. Only regret. She talked about the sleepless nights, the therapy sessions she attended in secret, the spiritual crisis that led her to question everything she believed in, her marriage, her faith, her purpose. She said there were nights she would walk the palace halls alone, whispering prayers not to God, but to someone who could no longer respond. You never get used to silence, she said, her eyes now wet. Not the kind that follows love. Not the kind that comes from exile, even if you're still wearing a crown. At one point, she appeared to reach for a small piece of paper from beside the camera. She unfolded it slowly. It was, she explained, the last letter she had ever written to Pope Francis, one she never sent. She read it aloud. I don't know if you'll ever read this. I don't even know if you're still thinking about me. But if you are, I want you to know I forgive you. Not for what happened, but for how it had to end. We were never meant to meet. And yet, somehow, you knew me better than anyone else ever has. After reading the letter, she folded it back, placed it in her lap, and looked back into the lens. "If this ever comes out," she said, her voice wavering, "then let them know I'm not proud of what I did. But I'm not ashamed of who I became through it." Sometimes we find our true selves in the eyes of people we're not allowed to love. The video ended without farewell. No closure. No final words. Just the soft dimming of light and the faint sound of a door closing behind her as she stood up and walked away. When the palace advisors finished viewing the video, there was a long pause before anyone spoke. One aide reportedly muttered, "She's destroyed herself." Another whispered, "She's freer now than she's ever been." The existence of this confession, once known only to a handful of senior royals and security officers, has now become a powder keg threatening to blow open the most carefully constructed narratives of modern monarchy. The palace, in an effort to maintain control, has never admitted to the video's existence. But pieces of it, short audio clips, a few transcribed sentences, and blurry screen captures, have leaked. Enough to confirm that the video was real, and that it was devastating. Whether Kate intended the video as a form of absolution, a warning, or a message to her children remains unclear. What is clear is that it was a choice. A deliberate, conscious act of confession in a world where silence is rewarded and truth is punished. Some insiders believe she made the video not to protect herself, but to prevent others from shaping the narrative if and when the letters came to light. Others suggest it was a form of emotional will, her way of documenting not just her actions, but her pain. Religious scholars have debated whether her connection with Pope Francis, as described, qualifies as spiritual adultery. Some defend her, calling it a human moment of connection between two deeply isolated people. Others condemn it outright, calling it a betrayal of vows, both sacred and matrimonial. But outside the court of opinion, one truth stands unshaken. The woman in that video was not a myth, not an icon. She was human, and her confession, whether viewed as brave or reckless, has changed everything. In the days that followed the video's leak, palace security reportedly conducted an extensive audit of all communication devices, laptops, and personal hard drives connected to royal residences. 2 staff members were dismissed. Legal teams were dispatched to block major media outlets from publishing footage. Yet the more they tried to bury it, the more fragments surfaced. And the public, despite being fed sanitized statements and official denials, began to ask the question that the crown feared most. What else is hidden? This video didn't just expose a secret affair. It revealed the crushing emotional cost of silence. It shattered the illusion that royalty are immune to weakness. And it showed, in the most brutally human way, that even the most admired can fall, not out of malice, but out of longing for something real in a world built on ceremony and control. The Vatican has long been a master of silence. It has weathered centuries of internal crisis, public scandal, and political upheaval with an institutional calm that borders on supernatural. But nothing in recent memory prepared it for the quiet chaos that followed Pope Francis's death and the revelation of his alleged relationship with Kate Middleton. For an institution that prides itself on absolute discretion, the breach wasn't just shocking, it was existential. In the days immediately following the Pope's passing, the Vatican was a place of mourning. Bells tolled throughout Rome. White banners lined the gates of St. Peter's Square. Hundreds of thousands of mourners poured in from across the globe to pay their respects to the man who, for more than a decade, had become a symbol of humility, modernity, and moral conviction in an increasingly divided world. But within the walls of the Apostolic Palace, a very different tone began to take hold. It started with whispers, confused aides exchanging glances in corridors, a sudden tightening of access to certain administrative offices, guards posted outside the papal apartments, unusual even in mourning periods. Then came the internal memo circulated to the College of Cardinals. All archives related to His Holiness's personal correspondence and private schedule are to be restricted until further notice. The message was signed by the Secretary of State, Cardinal Pietro Parolin, and stamped with a red seal reserved for emergency directives. This was not protocol. Even in the wake of a pope's death, access to private writings typically remains available to designated historians and clerics. The urgency of the restriction suggested that something more than grief was driving the lockdown. Vatican Watchers, a select group of journalists and scholars who monitor the Holy See's movements closely, noted a sudden change in press access. Previously scheduled media briefings were canceled. Access to senior cardinals for comment was revoked. A state of unofficial blackout had begun. Then, late in the evening of the third day of mourning, a convoy of blacked-out vehicles was seen leaving the Vatican grounds under heavy escort. Reports suggested they carried sensitive documents and digital drives, items believed to have been removed from the Pope's personal quarters. According to Italian investigative journalist Marco Lorenzi, who has long covered Vatican affairs, the order to secure these materials came directly from the newly formed Transitional Leadership Council. The mission? To prevent the spread of a potentially destabilizing narrative. That narrative, of course, was already spreading. As leaked fragments of the letters and video confession found their way into European media outlets, the Vatican found itself in an impossible position. If it acknowledged the documents, it would confirm one of the greatest personal scandals ever tied to the papacy. If it denied them, it risked an even greater backlash should more evidence surface. So, it did what the Vatican does best. It chose silence. But silence in the age of digital transparency only deepened suspicion. By the end of the first week, internal divisions among the Vatican's leadership began to emerge. Some cardinals reportedly advocated for a full audit and release of verified correspondence, claiming transparency was the only way to preserve moral authority. Others insisted on complete suppression, arguing that any acknowledgement would delegitimize not only Pope Francis's legacy, but the sanctity of the office itself. One high-ranking cleric, speaking anonymously to an Austrian newspaper, said the debate inside the Curia had turned bitter. "We are no longer discussing facts. We are debating whether to preserve truth or protect the Church," he said. There is no easy answer. Amid this internal struggle, a small but significant faction began circulating a proposal for a special inquiry, an unprecedented ecclesiastical review of the late Pope's final years. The goal? To determine whether his personal actions had undermined the Church's mission or left it exposed to reputational harm. But before the inquiry could gain momentum, it was quashed by a coalition of conservative bishops, several of whom had long resented Pope Francis's more progressive theology and feared any inquiry would become a political weapon against the institution itself. Still, cracks were forming. International pressure intensified. Catholic leaders in Latin America, where Pope Francis's influence was strongest, began receiving letters from parishioners demanding clarity. Social media accounts run by Catholic dioceses were inundated with questions. A trending topic emerged across multiple platforms. What did he write? Even in countries with strong church loyalty, younger generations began demanding answers. The damage, whether addressed or not, was already bleeding into the open. Faced with the looming threat of a global credibility collapse, the Vatican took a quiet but telling step. It sent diplomatic envoys to London, not to the British government, but directly to Kensington Palace. According to diplomatic sources, these envoys were instructed to discuss shared reputational interests and propose an informal agreement of non-disclosure regarding the leaked materials. Essentially, a ceasefire. Neither side would acknowledge the letters, the video, or the contents of any private exchanges between Pope Francis and Kate Middleton. If questioned, both would cite deep mutual respect and decline further comment. It was a strategy grounded not in truth, but in containment. Back inside the Vatican, the transition of power continued with forced dignity. Plans were underway for the conclave, where a new pope would eventually be elected. But as one cardinal reportedly told a confidant, "We are choosing not just a successor. We are choosing the man who will have to bury this scandal once and for all." The public, meanwhile, remained divided. Some rejected the leaks entirely, calling them blasphemous, fabricated, or the product of anti-Catholic sentiment. Others, particularly among more progressive Catholic circles, expressed sorrow rather than outrage. They viewed the affair as a tragic example of human fallibility and emotional entanglement between two overburdened figures trapped in lives of impossible expectation. They called for healing, not punishment. Yet even within the Vatican walls, some saw the scandal as an opportunity to re-examine a doctrine that demands emotional celibacy from its leaders while isolating them in spiritual and physical seclusion. A minority voice, but a growing one, began to question whether the system itself invited personal crises of the very kind now being exposed. The damage control wasn't limited to paperwork and back-channel diplomacy. Technical measures were also implemented. The Vatican Cybersecurity Division launched a full review of all internal communications from the past 5 years, searching for potential breaches. Employees were instructed to surrender personal devices for inspection. Access logs to the papal apartments were re-reviewed. An internal task force was established, codenamed Sanctus, reportedly consisting of archivists, legal scholars, and high-ranking clergy. Their job was to locate, isolate, and, if necessary, destroy any remaining unsanctioned communications tied to Pope Francis's relationship with Kate. But destruction in the digital age is never guaranteed. Despite the Vatican's best efforts, more letters surfaced. 2 weeks after the first leak, a new batch of messages appeared on an encrypted server hosted out of Iceland. These included scanned copies of letter drafts, some with editing marks in the Pope's own hand. One note, dated shortly before his final illness, read, "If history one day judges me, I hope it does so with mercy, not for what I felt, but for what I refused to act upon." That line reopened every debate the Church had tried to close. Did the Pope break his vows? Did Kate? Were there real-world consequences? Were political or theological decisions influenced by personal emotion? These were no longer just tabloid questions. They were now matters of doctrinal relevance. Seminaries debated them. Parish leaders were asked about them during confession. And in the absence of official answers, speculation reigned. Ultimately, the Vatican's damage control operation, while extensive, could not erase what had already entered public consciousness. The scandal was too big, the figures too prominent, the evidence too compelling. But the Vatican succeeded in one crucial way: it bought time. Time to deflect. Time to prepare the next pope. Time to rewrite the ending. Because as history has shown, the Vatican does not rush. It waits. And when the noise dies down, it decides how the story will be remembered. But in this case, it may not be able to decide alone. Not this time. Because while the Church can manage silence within its walls, it cannot control the voices outside. And those voices are asking harder questions every day. The British monarchy is an institution built on perception. Power has long since shifted away from the crown in legislative terms, but the symbolic influence of the royal family remains immense. Their authority comes not from laws, but from legacy, image, and the unwavering belief that they are the embodiment of dignity, tradition, and restraint. That is why scandal, particularly the kind that threatens to rip the curtain away from carefully curated appearances, is treated as a mortal threat behind palace walls. And this scandal, involving the future Queen of England and the deceased head of the Catholic Church, wasn't just damaging, it was catastrophic. Inside Buckingham Palace, the mood following Pope Francis's death was initially one of quiet respect. A formal statement was prepared and released, offering condolences on behalf of the royal family and acknowledging the Pope's legacy of compassion and service. Flags were lowered. A wreath was sent. It was routine protocol. But within 24 hours, rumors began to swirl. Anonymously sourced Italian reports hinted at personal correspondence between the late Pope and a member of the royal family. While the British press initially avoided the subject, international headlines made it impossible to ignore. By the second day, keywords linking Kate Middleton to the Vatican were trending across social media. That was the moment the tone inside the palace shifted from somber to panicked. Crisis meetings were convened across 3 royal residences: Buckingham Palace, Clarence House, and Kensington Palace. Senior advisors to the King, the Prince of Wales, and the Princess of Wales were called in for what insiders later described as an unprecedented emergency coordination. The royal household has endured scandals before: divorce, death, betrayal, but never one so intricately tied to another global institution. Never one that threatened to pull the heir's wife into a narrative that had already begun spiraling out of control. The first step taken was containment. All planned public appearances for Kate were either canceled or reassigned. William, who had been scheduled to open a new medical facility in Cornwall that week, carried out the engagement alone. In photos taken at the event, he appeared somber and withdrawn, barely interacting with attendees beyond formal greetings. Observers noted the absence of any mention of his wife, something that would have been considered unusual even days earlier. Behind the scenes, William was reportedly furious. Sources close to the family claimed he had been unaware of the full extent of Kate's alleged correspondence with Pope Francis until the letters began surfacing online. One aide described his reaction as a mixture of betrayal and disbelief. He kept saying he didn't recognize the person described in those messages, the aide revealed. He was angry, yes, but more than that, he was stunned. The king, too, was briefed extensively. Advisors emphasized the need to project unity in silence. No public statements. No denials. No acknowledgement that the palace was even aware of the controversy. The official line, "We do not comment on private matters." But privately, the king was said to be deeply troubled. At 75 years old and having only recently assumed the throne, Charles had hoped for a period of calm, a chance to modernize the monarchy without further turbulence. Instead, he found himself presiding over a crisis that threatened to destabilize the very image of the future queen. There was a brief and quiet push among some of the older courtiers to consider a temporary withdrawal of Kate from public life. Not a formal exile, but a sabbatical of sorts, under the guise of personal well-being. The proposal was met with strong resistance from her own communications team, who argued that any sudden disappearance would only confirm the worst assumptions. In the end, a compromise was reached. Kate would remain out of the spotlight for several weeks, but she would not be sent abroad or placed under official seclusion. That did not stop the press from speculating. Tabloids began to publish stories with suggestive headlines. "Where is Kate? William alone again. What he's not saying." Meanwhile, royal watchers and commentators debated every gesture, every facial expression, every schedule change. Photos of Kate arriving at Windsor Castle for a private audience with the king were scrutinized for signs of distress. One image, showing her wiping her eyes as she exited the vehicle, was interpreted by some as confirmation of emotional breakdown. Others insisted it was the wind. Amid the speculation, attention turned to the palace's inner workings. Who knew what, and when? Some reports suggested that senior royal aides had been aware of Kate's connection to Pope Francis for years but had dismissed it as harmless spiritual correspondence. Others claimed that palace security had intercepted letters as early as 2018 and chose to suppress them to avoid disruption. A former intelligence officer, who once worked with Royal Protective Services, hinted that certain communications were flagged but never reported to higher-ups. If that's true, it would mean the crisis wasn't just a personal one. It was institutional. Questions began to emerge about the monarchy's capacity to manage internal discipline. Could it be that one of its most senior members had carried on a relationship, emotional or otherwise, with the leader of another religion, right under the watch of royal handlers and state security? If so, what else had slipped through the cracks? Inside Kensington Palace, the pressure on Kate grew unbearable. According to one source with direct knowledge of palace operations, she withdrew almost entirely from daily meetings and staff interactions, communicating only through her private secretary and attending scheduled events by video call when absolutely necessary. She spent long hours in the private garden, walked frequently without security, and reportedly stopped eating regularly. Her children, still unaware of the growing controversy, were kept at a distance from the media and told their mother was taking a break. Those closest to her feared the worst. William, though still performing royal duties, was said to be in near-constant communication with senior advisors. He requested regular briefings on media coverage, legal risk assessments, and even sought spiritual counsel from the royal chaplain. The issue was no longer just about public relations, it was about family, and his role as future king. There were even rumors, unconfirmed but widely circulated, that William had spoken privately with his father about the possibility of a formal separation if the situation worsened. The suggestion stunned those in the palace, not least because of the potential constitutional implications. Kate, as the Princess of Wales, was not only a wife but a future queen consort. Any move to remove her from that role would set off legal debates and public backlash that could fracture the royal image permanently. Still, others within the institution feared something even more damaging, that Kate, under immense emotional strain, might choose to speak again. The confession video had not been intended for release. Its leaking had already caused irreparable damage. If she decided to give a formal interview, to sit down with the BBC or a trusted journalist and tell her side of the story, the monarchy might not recover. To prevent that possibility, palace lawyers were brought in to draft a revised confidentiality agreement. Sources say Kate was presented with a document reaffirming her obligations under the Official Secrets Act and the Royal Household Non-Disclosure Directive. She signed it, quietly, without argument. But the damage was already done. Even as the story began to fade from front-page news, its effects lingered. Public opinion shifted. Polling conducted in early April showed a drop in approval ratings for Kate, particularly among older, religious voters. Meanwhile, William's numbers remained steady, perhaps a reflection of public sympathy for a husband portrayed as betrayed. More concerning for the palace were internal surveys indicating a decline in trust toward the royal household as an institution. The scandal had revealed a crack in the facade, and the people had noticed. Internally, efforts were made to move on. New public appearances were scheduled. The couple, still officially united, appeared together at a hospital opening in Manchester. Smiles were forced. Cameras clicked. The monarchy carried on. But the tension was visible. Kate's posture was stiffer. William's glances were brief, almost clinical. For a pair once hailed as the model of modern royal romance, they now looked like actors performing a role neither of them wanted to rewrite. And in truth, they couldn't. Because the crown does not bend for personal pain. It hides it. It buries it. And it demands silence in return. The fallout from Kate's alleged connection with Pope Francis continues to shape the royal narrative in subtle ways. New protocols were introduced. All royal correspondence is now monitored by a 3-tiered security system. Personal letters must be reviewed by communications staff. And a quiet review of all royal family travel records over the last 5 years is reportedly underway. Yet none of these measures can undo what has already happened. A boundary was crossed, not just by Kate, but by an institution that allowed itself to believe it was untouchable. Now, every royal smile is viewed with a little more skepticism. Every